Let's talk about sinking fly lines. But before we get into the sinking fly lines themselves, we're going to have some of them are up now, some of them will be up by the end of the summer of 2018, other videos that are going to incorporate what we need to know about sinking fly lines. For instance, how do you make a streamer rig when you're attached to a sinker fly line? How do you roll cast pick up a sinking fly line out of the water? So there's a number of other places where sinking fly lines come up, and hopefully we'll have all those tapes up. Some of them are already up, some of those videos, but they'll be very helpful. So keep your eye open for those, and there'll be a lot of different, probably at least 4 or 5 different places where references will be made to sinking fly lines. Sinking fly lines are interesting. I've got 3 examples here. These are all 8-weight sinking fly lines. So there are different designations, we'll talk about it in a minute. But sinking fly lines are developed by impregnating the coating with tungsten or copper or some other metal. You can't really see this, but these are both 8-weight sinking fly lines, which means that the first 30 feet of these fly lines weighs about 210 grains. So that each one of these, if you look at the fly line, the rest of the fly line series, you're going to see that an 8-weight, the first 30 feet of an 8-weight fly line weigh about 210 grains. So both of these weigh 210 grains. The difference is the one on your left is going to sink at about somewhere around 5 to 6 inches per second. The one on your right is going to sink about 9 to 10 inches per second. The difference is this one on your left is way fatter. It's made fatter, so because of the heavier diameter, it sinks a little bit slower. This one is made skinnier. Because of the skinny diameter, it's going to sink faster. So even though they weigh the same, they're going to sink at different rates depending on the diameter. If you can't, again, you can't see this really well, but this one is not totally black. It's a little bit almost greenish, coppery colored, because they probably mixed some copper in with this one instead of just all tungsten. This one here is really very dark. It's black because it's got to be more dense. This one on your far right is even different. This one is this sinks at about 1 inch per second, and it's what we call an intermediate line. And this one you can see is almost clear. If I take this leader off here, this line here, I'm into the line now. You can't even see the line. The line is clear, pretty clear, and you can see it's much fatter. So now it's impregnated with, and I'm not even sure what it's impregnated with. It looks like a little bit of copper because it's got a copper glint to it, but it's a really fat diameter, and that's going to keep this thing from sinking very fast. So fly lines are designed to be, at least the sinking fly lines, to sink at different rates, and there's different lengths. We'll get into that in a minute. Let's talk a little bit about how they market them so you can kind of see what you're doing when you walk into a store. When you go into a store, one of the ways they sell them is by weight. In other words, you get a 6-weight sink tip that is a fast sink, a slow sink, a medium sink, or whatever. So if you have a 6-weight rod and you want a fast sink, you would just go to the store. You would find a fly line that says sinking line 24 feet, let's say you want it, and they go anywhere from 6 feet to 24 feet to a full 100% of the fly line is sinking line. But that, that would match your 6-weight rod. It's probably somewhere around 160 grains. That's what it weighs, and the only reason it's fast sink is, again, it's a little bit skinnier diameter than a slow sink or a medium sink. The other thing you can do, you can go into a store, and oftentimes they will sell sinking lines by grain. So you can go in and buy a 100 grain, a 200 grain, a 300 grain, a 400 grain. A couple weeks ago, I was in Texas fishing for stripers with a 515 grain sink tip line. And it had about a 24-foot sink tip on it, but it's 515 grains. So if you look at that 515 grain sink tip is not going to fish very well with a 6-weight line or a 7-weight line. So you need this is why people need to understand a little bit about the weight and what the rod is built for. For instance, if you get a 300 grain sink tip, that fly, you're going to put it on your 6-weight rod, then that 6-weight rod is really meant for maybe 160, 180 grains of weight. And now you're putting 300 grains on it. It's going to require an entirely different casting stroke. And unless it's a very stiff rod, you're going to have a lot of problems with it. So if you've got a 6-weight rod, you don't want to buy anything more than probably a 200 grain line for that 6-weight rod, or else just be safe and purchase a weighted line that's actually marked on the box. So if you're going to buy a sinking line by grain instead of by rod weight, rod designation, then a 6 weight is probably 100 grains. A 7 weight is 200 grains. An 8 weight is 300 grains, and a 9 weight is 400 grains. If you do that, then that rod is going to be very likely to be capable of casting that line well. So I think the biggest thing to remember is just to remember that these things have a specific use and they're specifically designed for specific rods. You can't just go in and buy a 400 grain fly line and put it on a 5 weight rod. It's just not going to work. This is an example of this is that 8 weight line that I was just showing you. This is called an integrated head. This right here is the sinking line, and this is the floating line. So this is a 24-foot sinking line. And if you'll notice, I put black magic marker dots all along the line right there, because that tells me it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's made for an 8 weight. So that's an 8 weight sink tip. And then on the bottom, I put 2 dots, which means that this is an 8 weight sink tip and it's sort of a medium sinking line. But this is an integrated head. You can also get shooting heads, and you can even get some leaders that are sort of shooting head leader type things that sink a little bit. So there's a lot of ways to do this. This is by far the most common. Today, almost all our sink tip lines that we're going to use, unless you're shooting for distance or you're shooting big flies with a spey rod and so on, a lot of people just use an integrated head, and this is what it is. It's just smooth. There's no knots. There's no loops. It just progresses from the sinking to the floating line. So which sinking line do you buy? So let's talk about a couple of scenarios, and then it might help you decide what line to buy. You know, I fish San Diego Bay sometimes as deep as 30 to 32 feet, in which case I'm going to use a really heavy 9, 10 inch a second sink tip that's maybe the whole line is 70, 80 feet of sink tip. That way or sinking line, I can get all the way to the bottom of that bay, and I've caught fish as deep as 42 feet in San Diego Bay. There are other times I'm fishing in really shallow places like 3 feet of water on Tampa Bay, where I'm using an intermediate sink tip, which is only going to sink about a second or 1 inch every second, and that's perfect for fishing a lot of the flats. It's going to sink a little bit, but it's going to also move the fly laterally. So think about that. You're going to purchase a fly line based on a number of factors: how deep the water is, how fast the water is, and how you want your fly to move. So we'll break it into little pieces. How deep the water is. Obviously, the deeper the water and the slower the water. If you have slow water and it's deep, you can get by with a line that doesn't sink very fast because you're not in a hurry. It can just get down. You're fishing a lake, a lot of techniques are you throw out a fly with an intermediate kind of line, or maybe even a mid kind of line like 2 or 3 inches per second, and you let it sink to the count of 2 and strip it back. You don't get anything. Throw it out again, sink it to the count of 6, strip it back. You don't get anything. Throw it out again, sink it to the count of 12, and all of a sudden you catch fish. Maybe that's where your schools of fish are schooled up, because that's the thermocline that you're in. So that's where all the fish are hanging out. So you might want a slower sinking line for that. Let's say you're in 25 feet of water and you want to get down there. You know the fish are down there. You're wasting a lot of time with a slow sink or medium sink line. You want a long line that's fast sinking. Same thing in a river. You've got a river that's let's say 6 foot deep run, and you want to get a line down pretty far. First off, you're going to have to generate some slack, and you can look at some of the videos on how to generate slack so that line will sink without being affected by the current, not hydroplaned up. So you're going to need a fast sinking line in that situation. You may be in other situations where you want, there are times on San Diego Bay I've got a 6 or an 8 foot long really slow sinking line. The only thing I want is I want that line to get a little bit below the surface, but I don't want it to drag my fly along the bottom. I want that fly to be relatively close to the bottom, but not on the bottom. Remember this, that if you got to think about what it is that you're trying to do, and what the bait that you're trying, or the fly that you're trying to imitate is what it's doing. For instance, trout in Tampa Bay, I don't use a sink tip line even if they're in 4 or 5 feet of water. I use a floating line because they seem to take a fly that jigs. So what I'm doing is floating lines up here. Every time I pull that floating line, the fly comes up, and every time I stop pulling it, the fly dives. So I've got a, let's say, an 8 foot or 9 foot leader on the end of a floating line. I'm pulling it, the fly dives up, the fly swims up, then I let it go, it dives down into the grass. I lift it up, it dives down into the grass. That's a deadly technique for catching sea run, or the trout that we have in Tampa Bay, spotted trout. So that's a really good technique. If you want a bait fish that's going to swim level, then you want a fly line that's at the same level as the bait fish. You want to pull that bait fish laterally. So you need to have a fly line that does that. You don't want to pull the bait fish up, and you don't want to pull it down. So you're going to have to decide what your sink rate is, how deep the water is, how fast the water is before you decide to do that. And I would suggest that you play around with them. If you're just starting out, and let's say you've got a 6-weight rod, buy a 6-weight medium and a 6-weight slow. And don't bother buying the fast ones. You'll have to practice when you get used to it. It's a slightly different casting technique to fish one of these things. And also, I just get probably a 25 footer. Remember, if you're fishing, let's say I'm fishing a big run, and all of a sudden I want to fish a riffle that's only a foot deep, and I've got a heavy line on, and I don't have another one because I just backpacked in or hiked in. If I throw that thing out and strip really fast, I can keep it from sinking. So I can strip it really fast, I can hold my rod tip up to fish it really fast. So there are ways to get by using too heavy a line for the situation, but there aren't too many ways to get by using too light a line for the situation. So if I'm going to make an error when I go out to fish, I'm going to usually, if I'm going to have to decide, I'm going to err on the side of too heavy rather than too light, because I can adjust the position of the fly in the water by the speed of the retrieve. So that's the other thing, remember, the speed of the retrieve. If you've got fairly shallow water and you can't move it fast because that's not what they're eating, you're eating crabs, let's say, on the bottom, and crabs are just crawling along, man, you have to be able to crawl that crab along, or close to the surface, or close to the bottom. So be careful about that. There's a lot of considerations. Just think about it. I hope this tape sort of helped clarify some of the things that you can do with sink tip lines. And again, we're going to have a lot more reference to sink tip lines in other places.